At this point, I'd like to introduce our, keynote speaker of today, who's been working on the research that we're trying to look at and talk about. And that person is Paul Smetanin, who is President and CEO of the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis. Paul has over 25 years' experience in risk management, risk measurement practices, mathematical modeling of systems, and now he's focusing on agent-based modeling to look at a number of these issues. He's been involved in Canada with a group of interdisciplinary researchers looking at these issues since 2001. Some of the work you may have read about, maybe not read in detail, read about. They've done work in infrastructure in Peel region. They did a background study for TCHC and looking at the benefits of the investment in social housing. And now they're applying their knowledge and skills to looking at affordable housing issues. So with that introduction, I'd like to invite Paul to come up and give us his presentation. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Today we're going to talk about affordability and quite possibly a new way of thinking about affordability and shelter and housing markets and things of that nature. Part of this research is phase one of a continuing research program that we've embarked upon, and it can't be done without the support of people like ResCon, which, as we're going through the topics today, just think for a minute, why is a residential construction association looking and deep diving into issues of affordability? And potentially when we get through the framework and the systems thinking and theory behind this, why haven't other organisations or agencies actually delved into these issues? The other thing I'd like to say is that it's a team effort. Can't be done without the support of the CANCEA team, David, Yana, who is a Ryerson grad. Fawaz has just stepped out of the room. Jason, thank you for your support. And also to our peer reviewers. All our research is peer reviewed, some anonymous and some not so anonymous, but all of their results have culminated ultimately into what we're going to talk today about is a framework in which we start to view the lens of shelter and affordability, primarily in Ontario. So we've all heard, we've all read, housing affordability is a growing problem. And it's been getting a growing public attention, media attention. The conversation is escalating. However, housing and affordability is probably one of the most complex systems that we've come across. And there are a broad range of issues in order to be able to understand what might be actually creating this problem. And the complexities of the interactions. One of the things that the financial crisis of 2007 taught central banks, financial modelers, economists, is that the models of yesterday seem not to work in the reality of what we're living in today. But it's also not just an analytic problem, a modelling problem, it's also a way of thinking. Things are very interconnected, probably more so than what they have ever been. And it begins with an appreciation of what is connected to what and how could things reverberate through our society and economy that we live in that could ultimately yield to unintended consequences. The other aspect is that we were asked to look at the question of housing and affordability. We're known for big data, big analytics, computer simulations, and doing analysis and modelling from a behavioural point of view, looking at the system from bottom up as opposed to top down. And so one of the things that when we started to consider the research and the literature is there appears to be no comprehensive study of supply and demand of the factors that actually affect affordability. And so our research objective, first and foremost, this is a qualitative study. When we embark on doing the big analytics and the massive computation behind what could be driving a certain phenomena, such as affordability, this study represents our calisthenics. What we do as a warm-up. We ultimately want to understand what seems to make this system tick, what seems to be connected, what seems to be the real issues, and ultimately we're not interested in telling you what to think. We're interested in giving you information to think about, and the agenda here is really, is this system sustainable? Is ultimately the question. And for us, as scientists, we need to be able to step into this with a framework. And that's essentially what this research is designed to do, is to think of things in terms of a framework. So, affordability it's a symptom of something very complex. And they've got a little bit of a cartoon, so to speak, in terms of some of the complexities around housing and the issues of affordability. So we begin with the fact that all people need shelter. We need shelter just the same way as we need food, for instance. And we have participants in our society that want to be able to satisfy their needs. But we also have participants in society that may want to consume more than what they need. And this is definitely a feature that we actually see in shelter markets. So we have a demand aspect. Notice we don't have ownership up here just yet. Really, the key issue behind housing and shelter is you need to use it. And so you have demand, and then obviously there's the supply side in terms of shelter stock, shelter formation, and then we have price market formation. And shelter and housing, so, I'm going to use shelter more or less interchangeably with housing. Most of you are used to dealing with the concept of housing. We deliberately use the concept of shelter because it's really about the use of housing. That for us, from a systems point of view, is the key issue. But it comes with many characteristics. We're not dealing with a margarine market that you could quickly go from one margarine on the shelf and go to another margarine. We're dealing with something that is very composite and has many different features that can be traded off each other. For instance, structure, density, and proximity are some of the features of shelter. And then you have economic prosperity and its distribution, looking at the question of what money do you have in the pocket to actually pay for your shelter. Then you've got the availability of credit, and all of these have impacts upon the way we demand housing and to try and satisfy our need for the use of housing or shelter. And then layered on top of that, you have investment markets. You have people in the market that want to own their own home, and then you have also people in the market that want to invest in homes. And then we continue. Then there's other costs, such as supporting the actual home, utilities and things of that nature. And there's other market supply constraints, such as labour or construction materials and associated costs. And then you've got essentially a public policy and government interactions behind this on the market side and in terms of what shelter is actually formed. But then you've also got government policy and regulation on the credit side and the financial side of the housing markets. And then, of course, the reason why we talk about affordability being a symptom is because out of all this, you actually start to see some pressure building up. And so you see this pressure in different, say, strata, for want of a better word, but you start to see some of this affordability pressure building up. And it's not a low-income problem anymore. It's actually a middle-income problem as well. And then you have 3 tiers of government. You have many different government agencies all looking at the nature of this particular system from different points of view. But no one government or government agency or market participant can actually see the whole system. And hence that's why we try and model systems and then delegate it to computers to help us understand what might the system actually look like. So in terms of the current debate, some of the things that we noticed in the current debate is that there's this use of affordability indexes. And we found that the current debate seemed to miss out on a lot of the texture and colour of the complexity that we were starting to see within the housing markets. And what we're finding, as you follow your nose around the entire system, you get an appreciation fairly quickly that affordability and shelter pretty much touches all aspects of our socio-economic system that we live in. And when we started to look at affordability indexes, we found that there is an inherent cost in home ownership that's embedded in affordability indexes. So that's starting to move towards ownership and away from the actual consumption or the use of shelter. We found that a lot of the complexity of shelter was being ignored, which I'll touch on shortly. The other aspect is the high use of averages, aggregates, silos. There's a high use of averages and aggregates, so none of us actually are an average. And so when you're using averages and aggregates, you tend to miss out on some of the key risks and the key issues that underlie those averages and aggregates. But the other aspect is that the debate about affordability, and because of the different indexes that are being used, we're having the conversation in silos. It's in a very unconnected way. And the thing is about a system, and particularly our socioeconomic system, it's very interconnected. And the other aspect is different stakeholders, different indexes. They're measuring different things. Despite the names that they give to indexes, they're not necessarily an index about affordability, and I'll make my point shortly. So a lot of these indexes and a lot of the affordability concepts that's in the literature concentrate on things, whether it's before tax income or rent or mortgage payments or municipal services, but not one index actually deals with all of them together. And in terms of need, when you look at the CMHC's definition of need, there is the features of adequacy, suitability, and affordability. But on suitability, for instance, adequacy is no major repairs. Suitability, there's enough bedrooms. So if you're a family of two parents, 2 children, and I give you a 4-bedroom shelter in the middle of nowhere, then you are now no longer in a core housing need. And so that's just an example of the kinds of features of shelter that we need to begin to consider when we're actually looking at the pressure on our society around shelter. And then affordability, no more than 30% of before tax income. Do you know what? I've never seen my before tax income because by definition, money's taken out before it's actually given to me. So we want to measure what's truly in your pocket in order to be able to pay for your need to use shelter. And just as by way of example, there's a lot of indexes out there, but we'll use the Bank of Canada Affordability Index as an example of some of the issues around some of these affordability indexes. And as you can see here, this goes back to the beginning of 1980. The affordability index, if we were to update it, it would actually come up to that black line. But according to the Bank of Canada Affordability Index, by its name, you would expect that it was measuring affordability. And there doesn't seem to be a problem. In fact, affordability is almost at or around the 30-year average. So things actually look pretty good. And we'll challenge this shortly. But to give you an idea of what this is really measuring, because it does include some utilities, but essentially when we overlay, if I simply just take housing prices multiplied by the current short-term interest rate and overlay that on top of the Bank of Canada index, it looks remarkably like the same thing. So the question is asked, what is the Bank of Canada Affordability Index actually measuring? Well, it's more of an investment index. It's more of a credit index. It's definitely, from our point of view, not, despite its name, an affordability index. So then we embark on, as we described, as I sort of mentioned earlier, we're doing our warm-up, we're doing our calisthenics before we actually get into figuring out the data requests, the mathematics and the simulations around affordability and shelter. So then, of course, we want to understand the salient features of what shelter actually represents, housing actually represents. And so, as I've mentioned before, you've got these, say, three categories, being structures, land density, and proximity. So where you actually have your home or your shelter is really dependent upon whether you can actually use it as shelter. Interesting behaviours emerge out of how many bedrooms, what piece of land is this, and where is that land located, where is my shelter located. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, you've got these supply activities, whether it's urban planning, regulation, infrastructure, and the investment of public infrastructure is something to be talked about. As a province and a country, for decades, we have been underinvesting in public infrastructure, and that is having an imprint on the affordability problem. But then we go a little bit further and we spoke about demarcating between, on the left-hand side, your need to use shelter versus your desire to actually want to own it. And then we go further in terms of under consumption. All of us have a non-discretionary, we don't have a choice, we need shelter, right? So we're going to call that a need for the moment. But then on the other side, there are choices that we make. A concept of a house or shelter can have societal status associated with it. Someone may earn sufficient amount of money in terms that they want more bedrooms than what they actually need. So there is this discretionary component around shelter as well. And then we go over to the investment side of the equation, and prima facie, or in the first instance, buying a home is ultimately a want, a discretionary decision. I would like to own something. And to sort of make the concept a bit easier, just because I eat food doesn't mean I have to own the farm. Okay, but somewhere in society, we've had culturally the idea of this creeping in that we must actually own our own home, which is fine. I'm not challenging social values or culture. This is just looking at what is the real problem and from a very systems point of view. But what we are seeing is that there are non-discretionary decisions being made where people can't find, say, rental units and things like that, but they actually have to buy their own home. Okay, so here is a bit of an understanding of some of the basic characteristics of shelter, and we're asking the question of, do we understand the forces at work? We're dealing with human behaviour around probably one of the biggest investment decisions they'll ever make on something that they need to satisfy every single day, every single week, every single month. Are we asking the right questions? And do we actually have a framework that we can start to pour all this data and interconnectivity into a particular framework? Again, I remind you, our research is qualitative at the moment. And this is essentially the warm-up that we're doing before we actually headlong get into the actual mathematics and the science and the simulations of shelter. So, housing affordability, shelter affordability is an extremely complex issue, but yet it's still considered very narrowly as the ability to purchase a home. And we know that it's actually much more than that. So to understand housing affordability, one of the things that we've posited is that you need to have a look at the true, first of all, the true cost of using shelter. So what does it take to actually get into shelter, use it, and that's just not rent. That's also, you need to give shelter warmth, in order to function as a home. You need to be able to get to other amenities and things of that nature. And then the other aspect, we must look at the true ability to pay for it, which is ultimately, how much money do I have in my pocket after I pay for other basic necessities? Do I have in my pocket to actually pay for my need to have shelter? So simply put, it appears to us that housing affordability is not particularly well understood. I know that's a very bold statement, but as we mentioned, we've done a lot of good science over the past decades, but when we were asked to look at housing and shelter, it's probably one of the most complicated and complex issues we've ever seen. And this research on its own has been about 4,000 hours of research just to begin to try and understand the shelter market, the affordability market. But if it's not well understood, then it becomes questionable as to whether it's well measured. So as part of our research, we've come up with 7 general concepts. And so the first concept, and I've belabored the point a little bit, is that shelter is a consumption good. We've got to use it. We've got to consume it. And then I've spoken about needs and wants. So there is a basic need in our society to have shelter, but there will be a competition with others in society that may want more shelter. It's a composite good. It has many different features that go into actually make shelter: structure, land density, location, proximity. And then you have this interaction of the various consumption markets, and in economics we call it substitution effects. So I might give up living downtown because I want more bedrooms and less density, say in more suburban areas and things of that nature. But then to further complicate things, you've got shelter, which is actually a capital good. It's an investment good. It's a store of value. And so you have this whole question of home ownership, and you have the interaction of consumption and investment markets now. And you also have wants and needs. You may have needs on the right-hand side leaking into needs that are looking for shelter on the left-hand side. And then you have needs and wants competing essentially and interacting now with housing formation, supply markets and other investors in the market. And so essentially through that diagram we've covered the first 5 basic concepts. The 6th concept, which is right at the centre of our research, and we're going to spend a couple of slides understanding this. Because it is really a behavioural process that most of the analysis just completely misses out on. And there is a new paradigm shift, and it's good to see the central banks, and it's good to see other banks around the world starting to embrace the new modelling and behavioural paradigm that the financial crisis of 2007 inspired people and forced them to look at. So in terms of needs, wants and crowding out, bottom line is that crowding out process in this research means that what you do can affect what I can get, or what I can do can affect what you get. So if you have in society people who have the financial capacity to be able to get the shelter they want, they could be pushing out others that actually are seeking to find the shelter that they need. That's the crowding out process. And because you're dealing with needs, we'll talk a little bit about public policy and the role of government across that entire complexity of what we call the affordability problem. And so one of the things that we decided to do in the middle of the research, given that we weren't particularly happy with the affordability indexes that we were seeing, is to actually come up with an affordability index, an index that we felt actually started to capture the pressures and issues of affordability better. And as you can see here, this is it's called the Shelter Consumption Affordability Ratio. It's a little bit wordy, in which reduces down to the SCAR index. And you can see here the primary feature of the SCAR index is on the top of the index of this ratio, we're looking at the true cost of actually using shelter. And that is then divided by your ability to pay for shelter after you've paid for all other necessities. And so we have put forth this particular SCAR index as a somewhat more fuller, more complete measure of affordability. And in terms of the ratio, as you can see on the right-hand side, you have things such as actual rents, imputed rents, maintenance, repair, insurance, utilities, and transportation costs associated because of the features and the characteristics that I mentioned earlier. And then in terms of understanding your ability to actually pay for shelter, we're looking at income from all sources. Less things like taxation, less the fact that you have to pay interest in your finance obligations, less the fact that you have to eat, you have to clothe yourself. Private healthcare, someone mentioned the other day, private healthcare, that's a stretch. Well, why don't you have a look at the healthcare system? We're very proud about our public healthcare system, but until you begin to interact with it, you only truly then begin to understand how much money you've got to pay out of your own pocket in order to be able to serve yourself from a healthcare point of view. But then there's other essential employment costs. Demographics is changing. Thinking of 30 years ago and what a household looked like 30 years ago doesn't apply today. We've got dual incomes, for instance. And so in order to have a dual income, in order to be able to cover the cost of your shelter, what does that imply? Daycare, for instance, or other expenses in which you have to incur to be able to go and get your employment income. And so that is the SCAR index. And the SCAR index, again, part of our calisthenics and warm-up was just to begin to understand what are the factors and the interconnectivity between the factors that we have to actually start to focus in on to begin to have a better appreciation of affordability. And so on the left-hand side, you have the numerator and the denominator of the SCAR index. And as I've just been through, you have the general above the on top of the ratio, on the bottom of the ratio, some of the key components, and then they can be, and I don't expect you to read that, but they're categories of influential factors on the SCAR index. And you can see many different categories here that combine to actually give us what is it the true cost of actually using shelter in the numerator or the top of the ratio versus your ability to actually pay for shelter, which is in the denominator at the bottom of the ratio. By the way, anyone can have a copy of this presentation later on. Just send us an email to either ResCon or to CANCEA. So let's take the SCAR index out for a spin. And again, this is preliminary. We are not doing any major simulations that we're known for as part of this particular research. We're just thinking about what to think about. We're trying to understand what are the things that we need to concentrate on. So this is the Bank of Canada Affordability Index that you actually saw in a previous slide. And what these grey bars represent is, and this is for Canada, and what the grey bars represent is when real housing prices increase by more than 4% annually. So you can see that the index itself, just by running your eye over it, is very sensitive to housing prices. Which is not unexpected given the previous comment that this is really an investment index. So now we overlay what is the SCAR index for Canada. And using Statistics Canada data to the extent that it can be used at this stage, we're able to actually come up with a preliminary view of what the consumption cost of shelter looks like as the SCAR ratio. So as you can see here, affordability pressures across the country are at an all-time high. You can also see here that affordability does not necessarily go hand in hand with housing prices. That there's a lot of different things going on behind the curtain that can actually affect a household's ability to be able to afford their shelter. And so we found that very interesting. So now we actually start to, because we live in differences. We don't particularly like averages and aggregates because none of us really are well represented by them. So now we go to the next level. Let's look at Ontario versus the rest of the country, and we found this interesting, that Ontario in the past has actually enjoyed lower affordability pressures than the rest of the country. And it wasn't until sort of about 2005-06 that Ontario actually caught up with the rest of the country. But here we can see, again, affordability pressures on the average. If we think of the whole province as an average, a weighted average, is still at an all-time high. And in fact, something's been going on, say, since 2006, in which affordability has increased quite substantially in Ontario. But averages are dangerous. And we wanted to, through this preliminary analysis, just get a sense of does the SCAR index actually, is it robust enough to sort of handle a view of some of the affordability pressures in society? So we can see, even through this preliminary analysis, we're comfortable enough to be able to say that there's at least about 1.2 million. And I say at least, we don't know. And in fact, one of the things that we found about the debate is the absence and lack of data. It's very hard to sort of really get down to what the affordability issues are. But at least 1.2 million households, there's about, 4.8 million households in Ontario? 1.2 million households are under significant affordability pressure. And that's about 26% of households in Ontario. So again, we don't like living in the average or the aggregates or the abstract for that matter. So let's understand, what does significant affordability pressure mean? What's it look like? So if I was to take a quarter of Ontario households, and that's the average at the end of the line, and I now use the arrow to go up, you can actually already start to see that there's a significant difference between some of the pressure that's under the waterline and what the average is actually indicating as affordability pressure. I don't know if you find that surprising, but I've misled you because it goes further. You actually have to keep going. If I use the scale on the left-hand side and look at this 26%, their SCAR index reading would be way at the top of the page. But I've misled you further. That's where, and that's what significant affordability pressure looks like. So while we're talking about statistics, averages and aggregates down at that bottom left-hand corner, there is a significant part of the population using the SCAR index, which is way up there at 62% of what they have in their pocket after they pay for basics. That's what it's costing for them to actually house themselves. And remember, we're not looking at mortgage payments, right? This isn't not an investment index. But that's a sort of preliminary view of some of the pressures that we can see. Now, this is not a story of the skies falling, but this is a story that there is a bit of pain out there for some. And we're still only just looking at Ontario. As part of our next round of research, what we're going to do is down to every single municipality, break down the housing market and household balance sheets and finances, and we've already got half the equation through our current platform. But we're going to begin to understand what affordability actually looks like municipality by municipality by municipality as part of phase 2. So there's about 840,000 homeowners that we can see at the moment that are under significant pressure. But you're going to find that there's a recurrent theme that's coming through this group. 480,000 of them, or close to 60% of those homeowners, are under the age of 45. And that's a recurrent theme. And we'll begin to explore the generation that followed the baby boomers. That generation has actually had to sort of deal with some very interesting socioeconomic changes, and we'll explore that a little bit further. And I haven't even started to talk about what CMHC would identify as the 380,000 renters that are effectively part of core housing need. The other thing is, let's have a sneak peek at debt. What's going on with debt? So recently, debt to income ratio has been reported to be about 1.63, 1.65. There's a really good joke. It's an old one. It's a good one. How do you know an economist has a sense of humour? Right? It's when they start putting decimal places into their results. Because the point is that no one really knows. So whether it's 1.63 or 1.65 doesn't matter, but this is essentially the growth of debt within households since the early 1990s. But so again, remember the theme: averages, aggregates are dangerous, particularly when we're looking at who's hurting, who's under pressure, and then even more particularly when we start to look at systemic risk. So if I take 1.63 times as the national average of debt to income, I then overlay on top of that, that looks like a very busy graph, but I'll explain to you in a minute what it means. You've now got each age group, 20-somethings, 30-somethings, 40-somethings, and so on and so forth. And what these bar graphs show is each decile. So in the 40-somethings or the 30-somethings, they're now broken down between income earners in the bottom 10%, the second bottom, third bottom, all the way to the top. And then for the 40s and 50-something, and start to look at how many times on average, we're still living in an average, how many times is their debt to income ratio exceed the national average? And you actually start to see an emerging pattern. So, key message, one of the things I'd like you to think about when you go home today is averages and aggregates are dangerous. So we then come down to three, what seems to be driving the process. So as systems theorists, we're interested in what actually drives processes. We're interested in sustainability. Is this a system that's going to fall flat on its face, or is this a system that is under a lot of pressure and will eventually solve itself? And so everything is contrasted against the framework of SCAR, the Shelter Consumption Affordability Ratio. And in the middle of the page, you can see that we've got the cost of using shelter divided by your ability to be able to pay for shelter. And there's three key processes that we've, in this early stage of our research, quite interested in. At the bottom, you've got this question of the generation and distribution of economic prosperity. At the top, we're going to talk a little bit more about needs, wants, and crowding out. And then, given the needs issue, and given the fact that land, and there's a lot of government fingerprints over the entire system of housing and affordability and finance, there is this question of the public policy and the role of government. So let's first deal with the ability to get money in your pocket. How much money do you have in your pocket in order to be able to pay for your shelter? Oh, okay. So we're dealing with the bottom part of the ratio here, and you can see that there's a few words up here, sort of stagnating wages and things like that, but in the bottom right-hand side, you know it's coming. We'll actually take you through some examples of what life looks like for different parts of the population on the bottom part of this ratio. So let's begin with corporate and labour share of income. So what this graph represents is the blue line is the productivity of businesses altogether in terms of when they pull different factors of production, how is their productivity changing in time? And then you've got labour, which is the black line. So you can see that labour productivity has been increasing, but at a slower rate. But from a business productivity point of view, again, and and it is an average. This is something that we'll get into further with our second round of research, but multi-factor productivity, or the productivity of businesses, has been pretty much stagnant since the mid to late 80s. This, by the way, is a global phenomenon. It's not unique to Canada. However, if there are issues here right now, does it really matter what's going on in a country in Europe somewhere? This is where we've got to live, work and play. So typically in economics, as productivity is increasing, there is a direct positive relationship to increasing real wages. So let's have a look at that. And we see that labour productivity, while it's been increasing in time, wages have been stagnant in real terms. They're not really growing. So we have a little bit of a challenge here between economic theory and what we actually see happening on the ground. So let's have a look at the black line a little bit more and actually get into the black line. So we see here that there is an industry wage inequality. So what this graph is showing is that there's, say, 3 major tiers. Depending upon what industry you're in, you'll actually have a somewhat different income wage experience. And so you've got the high industries, you've got the low industries, which is the bottom line, and then you've got the middle industries, which is very close to the average. That dotted line, if I was just to put the average up, that's what you'd see. You would not get the appreciation that there's structure and differences behind this. So let's actually see, well, what industries are we talking about? It's so in terms of the high wage industries, we've got construction and professional technical services. Teachers seem to be doing well, and if you work for government, typically your experience is probably better than a majority of the rest of the population. And then at the bottom, we're looking at things like agriculture and trade and support services and things like that. And I will just give you a quick question is, well, what age groups do you think are in what industries? Right, so that's a point of reflection. What industries? So in the middle, because I haven't mentioned things like manufacturing and wholesale and real economy stuff, with the exception of construction and some utilities, is basically in the lower tiers of the industry wage stratification. So let's actually have a look at the quality of employment. So we see that part-time work, and I haven't put contract work here, I haven't put sole proprietors up here, this is just part-time work. Part-time work has been increasing since 2000, and when you actually have a look at a large urban centre, such as Toronto, it's been really increasing. So then we actually ask the question, well, what age groups dominate part-time labour, precarious employment, and we start to see, so 20% of the economy is made up of part-time, and 63% of that is made up of people under the age of 45. So, there's a little bit of a sort of recurring theme that's occurring here. And then, of course, we can start to look at inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality. Remember the corporate productivity has been flat. Labour productivity has been somewhat increasing, but at a lower rate. So who's been getting the profits? And you can begin to see that essentially anyone that owns stocks and things like that will tend to get a bigger share of the pie when it comes to distributing, say, corporate profits and things of that nature. And yes, the government has gone to some extent to even out through risk redistribution policies about 44% of what inequality could have been, so that's a plus. And then we have a look at, well, what is the percentage change just by quintiles across the population. And this is since the early 70s, looking at real changes in income. And so you see that the second and the third, fourth and the third quintiles here, that's essentially the middle class, and that's where a lot of the crowding out effects are actually occurring. But this is giving you a sense that there are a lot of differences across households. And what we've learned about systems, it's in the differences that you get very interesting phenomena. It's in the differences that you actually start to see certain risks emerge. And then I'll just finish up on here in terms of the wealth inequality, right? So there does seem to be the initial conditions for some sort of competition between different generations, people who work for different industries, people who actually have different net household assets. And then, of course, on top of that, because we're looking at the use of shelter and the expenses associated with just living, of course, many of these things are well above the what we would call the inflation rate. So I hope I've given you a sense of what seems to be going on in the bottom part of the ratio. And so now we'll actually start to look at the what's happening above the ratio in terms of shelter consumption costs. And that's where we're starting to focus on needs, wants, and crowding out. And again, this is central to our research. If you wanted to blow our research out of the water, then this is it. This is the underbelly of it. So crowding out occurs when the behaviour, consumption or investment behaviour of some can actually deny others getting access to it. Now, the thing is that economics doesn't have a problem with this. Basically, economics makes certain assumptions, is that a household's ability to participate in a market is determined by their willingness to pay a price. And the underlying assumption in economics is your willingness to pay to a price closely corresponds to your ability to pay that price. Okay? And in economics, we tend to think that everyone takes rational risks according to their unique situation, and everyone's responsible for the risks they take. So that is the economic theory applied to this particular activity. The problem is shelter is a need. And economic theory once again starts to break down. Is you cannot just simply decide, I'm done. I'm opting out of the market. The price is too high. You need it. You need to get it. You need to compete for it. And so households trying to satisfy their needs, they have a greater willingness to pay the price to get it than someone who is in the market looking to satisfy their want. So, you know, single man in Toronto, if I'm interested in a 3-bedroom house somewhere in Toronto, my willingness to pay a price is somewhat a little different to when I'm competing with, say, a household of 2 adults and 3 children. So the key point here is willingness and the ability to pay for a need can diverge, and it has. The very essence of the affordability, this is the very essence of the affordability problem, is that you're basically looking at housing in a needs market, assuming that there's sufficient housing stock, and I can talk to that later, but there does appear to be enough housing stock, but not enough fat in the system in order to be able to remedy some of these very pressures that we're talking about. So then I bring you back to the characteristics of shelter, and everything comes back to the characteristics of shelter. It's a need, it's a composite good, people are going to compete for it. And on the left-hand side here, you've got consumption, the right-hand side, you've got investment. So on the left-hand side, you have people that do not have a choice, but they have to get shelter. And you have people that would like more of it than what they need, which is not a problem. It's really a question of sustainability. And these two markets will compete with each other. And then, of course, you have the want market that will actually go into the investment market, households that actually want to own their own home. And typically that's a discretionary choice. And they will actually compete with each other. But then you also have the fact that if you can't go and rent what you need, guess what, guys? You've got to buy it. And that could be a public policy issue. But here you can see different competitions, different pressures occurring across essentially what we would call the housing market. And then you've got these cross effects that are leaking into each other. So when you're looking at just one dwelling type in one region, one municipality, for instance, you've got at least 16 different pressure points. And that scales exponentially when you start to add different kinds of dwelling and competitions between different regions. And so my point is very simple. There's a lot going on here. The point is about what you have a choice to do and what you don't have a choice to do. So needs, wants and crowding out. Causes of crowding out. So you get crowding out in the way that we're describing it in this research when you have different motivations in the market. So you have investors that want investment, that want particular property types, and you have participants in the market that want more than what they need, and things of that nature. So, we'll put a little tick against that one. In terms of there definitely seems to be pressures and influences within the system. And then, as I've laboured the point, there are differences for different households, the ability to pay. Right? And then the third one is differences in housing desirability. So I'll give you a quick thought experiment. If I put food in the middle of the table here and I gave you all exactly the same amount of money, and I pretty much, the food is all the same kind of food, then you would have not as much crowding out. Because you won't be competing with each other in terms of who actually gets to eat the food, because eventually those who are trying to buy more food than others will exhaust their ability to be able to buy food. Crowding out occurs when I actually now spread some money around, but I give different people different amounts of money, and I start to differentiate. I start to put different kinds of food on the table. And you'll actually start to see that some people will be able to buy more than others, and eventually you'll find that there's going to be some people in the room that actually can't afford to buy food. And that's essentially part of the crowding out process in a sort of a very general stylistic manner. On the right-hand side, there's many factors that lead to differences in the ability to pay, differences in housing desirability. So housing desirability. What can differentiate one particular neighbourhood in the GTHA from another neighbourhood? Transportation, proximity to work, density, number of bedrooms, things of that nature. So, for instance, public infrastructure has got a significant effect in terms of making some housing look more desirable than other housing. Symptoms of crowding out this is essentially the evidence that there does appear to be a crowding out problem occurring, but we're not going to actually understand this process until we get to the next stage of our research, which means delegating a lot of this complexity to computer simulations to tell us and teach us to what degree there is a particular crowding out problem. But the symptoms of crowding out is definitely there. When you start to see an increasing share of middle income households, for instance, in core housing needs, when you see a rising share of households engaging in risky financing activities, and we'll talk a little bit about that. When you need something, why should it surprise you that mortgage fraud would be in the system? Why would it surprise you that people will actually borrow more than what they can pay in the system when you're dealing with a needs-based market? And then, of course, we do see affordability pressures for a growing proportion of the population. These are features of a crowding out problem. And typically you'll have a crowding out problem when you have differences in household incomes and balance sheets, but you also have some significant differences in the housing stock that's there, but also what's actually coming online. And is there enough supply? You might have a one-year supply of land in a particular area, but that may not be sufficient to prevent a crowding out cycle occurring within that particular region, because crowding out is instantaneous and actually starts to really sort of kick in quickly And crowding out really needs in order to be able to mitigate it, you actually need longer term plans, and you need a little bit of fat in the system, right, to actually start to prevent the system from essentially blowing its brains apart by competing with each other. And so there is a public policy and a government role here. And as you can see by the way I've shaded them here, there's a lot of government policies and agencies that are involved that actually begin to contribute to differences in housing desirability, for instance, and the crowding out problem. So the question is from a public policy point of view and a government point of view, the conjecture here is that affordability challenge is, how do you allow a society to be able to pursue what it wants without restricting the needs of others within that same society? How do you allow a society to actually grow and prosper, but without certain people pursuing what they want to do or what they need to do without putting the system at risk as a whole? And so this is essentially what I would probably call a responsible mixed market, in which you have free market forces and then you have public policy, which is there to basically be a referee and make sure that no one's pursuing what they want to do at the behest of someone else in the system. And so you've then got the interaction of three tiers of government with free market forces and many different government agencies that all have a line of sight on this big complicated system, but no one actually can see the whole picture. And again, we ask the questions, what are the forces at work? Are we asking the right questions? You know, do we have a framework to ask the right questions? Are we actually going to let this happen to us, or are we actually going to be involved in the management and planning of avoiding certain affordability issues in our society? And who has the tools to actually understand this? There's a quote from Oxford University that came out after the 2007 financial crisis, and I love the quote. And basically, they were saying, and it's the Institute of New Economic Thinking, and they're saying, look, if you think that government has got all the numbers and the mathematics and the systems in order to be able to understand the very system that they're a steward over, then you're really, really, really wrong, right? And in fact, the quote is, they are flying by the seat of their pants. A lot of people, and even this morning in the papers, there's conversations around, oh, this is what affordability looks like, or here's some of the risk in the system and everything else. Guess what? We feel, after doing some of this research, that we're having the same conversation that the Americans were having in early 2006, but they didn't see what had happened truly coming. And I'm more than happy to talk a little bit further about some of the pressures here. Is this the American example all over again? I don't think so. I think this is going to play out very differently. And actually, if something occurs in the future, whether it's job losses or whether it's interest rates or inflation, I think it will sort of occur in a very different way, but it'll actually occur in a more systemic and profound way to the Ontario economy. So now we come back to, well, how do we understand systemic risk, cheap credit in the context of the SCAR index? So there's the SCAR index. We have the generation and distribution of economic prosperity. I'm hoping now you've got a sense of some of the key forces at work under the waterline in terms of people's ability to pay. They have a need for shelter. When you add cheap credit, accessibility to cheap credit, you're essentially taking small disposable income and giving certain individuals much greater ability to actually bid for what they need within a market. And so you start to sort of see some needs, wants and crowding out in terms of people, and again, it's the behaviour. And I'll talk about some of the behaviour around shelter and price formation around shelter shortly. But essentially, think of the situation in Ontario as there is a tight competition between needs and wants, investors, homeowners, and the fact that foreign money is in the system, again, really? Right, why should that be a surprise? We've had liberalisation of at least 2 major economies over the last 15 years, 20 years. And then you've got political instability in the Persian Gulf and other places. Where do you think that money's going to go? So coming back to this is increased leverage. So here's the thing about systemic risk is borrowing to invest in assets is fine, but what it does is if that asset varies in price a lot, my mortgage payment won't. It's fixed. And so you're starting to see this increased leverage in balance sheets, and then that circles around back to greater pressure within the housing markets, which essentially circles around to embedding essentially what we would call much higher non-discretionary risk in the balance sheets of several households. So a non-discretionary risk is, okay, I've had enough, I don't want to play anymore, I want to get out of the market, I can't get out of the market. So we come back to this as having a look at debt divided by income, and we actually start to look at where some of these households and where the debt actually sits behind this. And it's really about the 30-somethings, 40-somethings, and to some extent the 50-somethings. But this table is essentially showing that in the 30s and the 40s, about 70% of people in those 2 age brackets, 70% are above the national average. And on average, they're about 1.6 to 1.8 times more than the national average. We see that there's more in there, much higher, but we're just sort of sticking to the point here. And in those 2 age groups, in terms of the 30-somethings that are exposed, 40% of that group is actually under the average income for their demographic in Ontario. And for the 40-somethings, 30%. So we're starting to sort of see this, that there is definitely a build-up in household debt and the ability to pay is under pressure. But as we've already reflected upon, while you'll have the Bank of Canada and others are concerned about the systemic risk in the system, affordability should not come as a surprise that it is actually at an all-time high already. And so I've just got 2 more slides. Just on the needs, wants and crowding out and systemic risk. Found this interesting while we were doing our research. Found this an interesting statement by the Bank of Canada governor. And basically, it's not the role of the Bank of Canada or anyone in control of monetary policy to protect individuals from making bad choices. So what does that sound like? Well, that sounds like economic theory to me, being, basically replaying itself, that households will participate in a market to the extent of their ability to be able to pay. Someone's willingness to pay a price corresponds to their ability to pay that price. Households will take rational risks. But the problem, again, is that shelter is a need. You just can't leave the market. There are complex behaviours around needs. Economic theory, and I'm happy to be on record for this, does not deal with needs very well, if at all. Economic theory assumes that you have the capacity to support what you're prepared to pay in a market, that you reveal your preference for something by the way you act in a market. But when you need something, then most of that process actually begins to break down. And this is in part the very essence of the affordability problem. Now, when you're, for instance, a monetary agency that has the ability to change interest rates considerably and open and close the rules around borrowing, right, I'm wondering if they actually understand the very market that they're affecting, right? This is a complex problem. And it, from our point of view, should not come as a surprise that certain things will happen in a needs market when you actually start throwing, say, for instance, cheap credit at it. So, affordability is a symptom of something complex. In terms of a systemic risk, we do have households out there that are increasingly reliant upon credit. We do have a generation that views credit as it's okay to borrow to actually spend it on a consumable, which is fine as long as it's sustainable. Economic growth has now become more susceptible to precarious employment. There's a significant vulnerable group. So one of the things when we simulate the Canadian economy down to municipality across the whole country, yes, over 5,500 regions are simulated all at once. And we see a lot of these consumption pressures emerging. There's an uncomfortable status quo. And if you're in government and you're running models, I suspect, I don't know this, but I suspect that when provincial and federal governments model their expected taxation revenues, my suspicion is they're probably always overshooting what they end up getting. Because there is some constraints in the system that we're already starting to see kick in. There is an uncomfortable status quo, which means that if the US takes off and starts being growing, you'll find that we may not be able to follow them to the extent that we have shortly. In terms of the vulnerabilities, the key vulnerability that we think is going to be job losses. But this is the situation that we're currently in. Smaller economic shocks could lead to contagion. Economically vulnerable homeowners might induce the risk of contagion through the system. We're not saying that from our point of view, if nothing changes, the system might be able to ride itself out. The problem is that everything's changing all the time. So you get higher interest rates, inflation or job losses. It will be of interest to see what begins to happen. But there is a risk to the economic contribution of the residential construction market. So when we look at the connection in terms of how things are connected, we actually see the economy, the labour force and the residential construction market, they're actually going to get squeezed. We actually don't see this as a significant bank problem. When you look at guarantees of housing debt and things like that, we see this more of a really economy problem, which sort of makes it somewhat different to what the experience will be from as opposed to the US economy. And then the last point here is that there's significant implications for fiscal policy and taxpayers. So a lot of the risk is in the US, when the US started to have problems, it took a while to get around to the taxpayer. In Canada, there's more of a direct line of sight to the taxpayer in terms of some of these systemic risks that have accrued within the system. But even more so, you've got households and you've got under 45s, which is the creme de la creme of consumption, with a lot of debt. So when they come under pressure, you're going to find consumption will actually start to contract. So final remarks, housing prices and wants are not a problem as long as it's sustainable. This is a cartoon. This cartoon keeps coming back to me every time since the early 90s. But basically, someone's dropped their keys and the policeman's come along and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I dropped my keys." And the policeman's saying, "Well, what, you dropped them under the light?" He said, "No, but this is the only place I can see." And so the affordability problem and the housing market challenges remind me of this cartoon, is we're looking at what we can see, whereas actually the big risks are actually hidden and embedded out there. There is a lot of people out there that are under pressure. And while at times we can become cognitively numb to the pain that's going on out there because we're doing the numbers in here in an office in a suit, right? The numbers are telling us there is a lot of pain going on out there. Again, we're not sort of saying what you should think. We're not on the political spectrum. This is really about giving you information to think about. For us, this is a qualitative analysis that's warming us up to get into the big data, the big computing simulations that will help us better understand what this problem looks like. And so the current research for us is we've got more questions than what we have answers. We can't say that we understand this. But given the complexity of this, I'm not sure that too many other people can actually say that they understand it as well. And so the complexity of the system needs to be understood. Obviously, there needs to be further research. But, we would stress not the same way, not the same research, not the same math, not the same analysis that was actually part of when the problem was occurring. We're going to need some new research. We need to be able to investigate the interconnectivity and what the risks, how the risks could actually allow the dominoes to fall in a particular way that could put our economic prosperity at significant risk. And there is definitely a role for greater understanding and coordination by public policy and government agencies. And given that shelter and housing is such a profound connected issue for our socioeconomic well-being, one of the key issues is a greater level of coordination and perhaps starting to get some of these disparate agencies that are looking at each issue in pieces into the same room to have that conversation. I'm going to finish up there. Thank you for your time, and I'm open to some questions.
So we'll have time now for a question or two, but just as Paul referred to calisthenics in his presentation, this presentation by Paul is calisthenics, warming him up for the panel that is going to occur after the break. And so we've got a lot of different experts that will join Paul up here after the break. But before that, we do have time for a couple questions. And we'd really like to thank Paul and his team for the research that has gone into this. And we'd also like to thank the board. The reason for that is, when you partner with a group like CANCEA, they're an independent group, they're academic-based, they do excellent work, as we can all see, but you give up control. And so I'd like to thank the board for doing that. I think the value in some of this research is the fact that CANCEA is very independent. They have a very excellent network of peer reviewers, and as you can see today and with their past studies, their work is second to none. So thank you to Paul and his team, and if there is a question or two before the break, we've got time for that. Otherwise, we've got a dynamite panel that awaits us on the other side of that break. So any questions from the floor? Yes. And there's microphones too, if that helps. Even better.
I had a question about development charges, HST, land transfer taxes. I didn't see any of those taxation review charges that go on that. Sometimes you're accounting for about $100,000 per home. So that has to be a major cost driver. If you put those policies on your timeline, you're going to see that that's one of the major cost drivers.
Yeah, it's in there. It's most definitely in there, and in fact, you could go further to say that housing prices is masking some of these pressures, or the ability of the municipalities to be able to raise funds to have some growth, try and pay for all growth on the ground. But yeah, looking at our report, you'll see it's very much in there. And even the way different tiers of government redistribute taxation revenues, there's a discussion of that in there as well. Sure, while there is a sort of a very booming, growing housing prices, again, it's about human behaviour on the ground. Municipalities can be between a rock and a hard place at times, given they've got limited fiscal tools, but at the same time, you're underwriting a higher cost of shelter in society. Like if there were to be a market correction, and I'm not saying that there's going to be, there could be a significant one if things change, but if nothing changes, we should be good. But that's going to rear this head of higher costs embedded in the formation of shelter that will be in there. So most definitely the issues are there. You saw the slide with all the multitude of different factors. And we're interested Well, municipal policies are in there. So we're very interested because everyone seems to, in this complex system, say, it's this, or it's land availability. You know, it's also entangled that it's hard to say if it's just one, another, or a combination of a bunch. And that's why we end up wanting to delegate to the computer systems to be able to teach us what seems to go with what seems to be an accruing problem within this affordability challenge, and then later on run experiments to see, well, what might the policy remedies look like? You know, how can we sort of change the rules a little bit in order to be able to make this a little bit more sustainable?